The RMT has announced 3 days of national rail strikes due to take place on the 21st, 23rd and 25th of June. That's as well as a London-wide strike action on the Underground on the 21st. This is how the mainstream media reacted.
The biggest rail strike in more than 30 years, set to cause midsummer misery. 50,000 rail workers will take industrial action over 3 days later this month, threatening to bring the train network to a standstill.
I was going to say a car crash. That's the wrong analogy. It's a train wreck.
You say you don't want to cause misery. You are causing misery. Is there not another way that doesn't involve going on strike?
Does the means justify the end? You, of course, have an absolute right to strike, and you have an absolute right to push hard for better pay and conditions and safety and all the rest of it. But you're actually holding the public to hostage. You're not really actually affecting your bosses, you're affecting ordinary men and women who won't be able to get to work, who won't be able to go on holiday. Also, there are so many events happening in that week, and I suspect that's why you've picked that week. There's Glastonbury, there's a huge Elton John concert, many other things, all of which are going to be severely disrupted, and people's pleasure and enjoyment and functionality are going to be hit. You're basically holding the public to hostage. That's what's coming through.
You sound like a dinosaur from the 70s. You wipe off the misery you're gonna enforce on the working class people as regrettable. Seriously, regrettable? It's a little bit more than regrettable. And you're suggesting that companies shouldn't make a profit, and that if they do, they should give them to you? Seriously?
You're suggesting that companies should share their profits with their workers? Seriously? Yes, Carol. When people haven't had a pay rise in 3 years, and when companies are threatening to make redundancies to people's colleagues, all to increase shareholders' profits, and when the cost of living is going up and up, yes, that's exactly what companies should be doing. Now, despite the furious opposition from people who all get paid more than what railway workers are demanding, the RMT's General Secretary, Mick Lynch, gave this calm account of why the strike has been called.
In the last few minutes, Downing Street has described the plans by the rail unions as selfish and thoroughly irresponsible. Let's get the reaction from the General Secretary of the RMT union, Mick Lynch. Shall we? Hi, morning, Mick. What do you make of those words? Selfish and irresponsible, the government says.
Well, this government are experts at being selfish and irresponsible. That's not what our union is, and it's not what the tens of thousands of ordinary men and women in our union are all about. We've been waiting patiently for 2 or 3 years for a real pay rise and a pay offer. We haven't had that for the vast majority of the people involved in this dispute. What we've had in return for working all the way through the pandemic, in the workplace, not working from home, running our transport services, is the threat of thousands and thousands of job cuts, the stripping back of services, the closure of virtually all of the ticket offices in Britain, and the ripping up of our conditions. So we haven't got a deal on pay for 3 years while inflation is rampant. We've got the threat of job cuts. We've got threats to the safety regime on our system, and our members have had enough, as have many British workers. We need a pay deal. We need job security, and we need decent terms and conditions. That's what this dispute is about. The government have got the key to unlock that. They've cut the funding to the railway by £2 billion. They're stopping the companies making proper offers and having proper discussions, and they need to loosen those shackles and get a deal so that we can avoid this disruption and these disputes.
Of course, the government isn't interested in negotiating better wages or job security or supporting workers to do so. Instead, they'd prefer to break the strike through the law if necessary. Tory MP Hugh Merriman is head of the Transport Select Committee. This was his proposal on the BBC's Today programme.
You're saying the government should have put in place measures that would have made it illegal for some of the strike action to take place?
Well, it's not so much making it illegal, it just adds a requirement for there to be a minimum service obligation, as there is in those other EU countries I mentioned. If that's the case, then it means there's still some trains that operate, and it therefore makes it harder for everything to be ground to a halt. Bear in mind that we regard the rail as an essential service. That's why we kept it running during the pandemic for key workers. So if it was right that we kept the railway running then, it's surely right that we keep it running during industrial action.
Right. So are you saying the government could do that and ought to consider doing that now as an emergency measure?
Well, I'm saying that the government committed, if it was re-elected in 2019, that it would bring in a minimum service obligation. It happens in other EU countries like France, Spain and Italy. And if the government wants to succeed in reforming the railways and getting through this industrial action, then it may well need that legislation in place in order to strengthen its arm.
It's a pretty gross argument. Railway workers continued to work during the pandemic, often at great risk, by the way. Many people on public transport, many people who worked on public transport died from COVID-19. And instead of rewarding these people for that very, very important effort, we're going to use them turning up during a pandemic as an argument to restrict their right to strike. Merriman even comes clean about the real reason for promoting this legislation later in the interview. It isn't about stopping disruption or about keeping the railway working. It's about strengthening the government's arm. In other words, weakening the bargaining position of the union, of the workers who provided that wonderful, brave service during the pandemic. I want to go to a super chat now if I can, Fox. It's from Marky ZNO with a fiver. I'm cheesed off with the strike as I was going to see 9 Inch Nails, better than Elton John. I still stand in solidarity with the unions, though. I just wanted to read that because I think that is, absolutely the correct position. There's no shame in being frustrated when the railways aren't running. Obviously, we would prefer them to be running, but we would prefer them to be running because workers and bosses have come to an agreement, because bosses have given up on their strategy of making people redundant after they've worked through a pandemic and not giving people a pay rise for 3 years. What you did say, though, is it's frustrating, and people in Britain do have good reasons to be frustrated with our railways all the time, whether or not there's a strike. For one, that's because it's really very expensive. As you can see here, train fares per mile by country, when you're looking at Britain, 55p per mile. In France, 29p. In Ireland, 27p. In Germany, 19p. And in Italy, 14p. So we are massively more expensive than in comparable countries. And it seems that much of this is because our railways are privatised. And so those high prices seem to have led the British public to want Britain's railways to be renationalised. A massive 60% support renationalisation, including majorities among Labour, Tory and Lib Dem voters. Which is perhaps why some people are resistant to the government's narrative on the railway strike.
If that's the only way they're going to be listened to, then so be it. Somebody has to be held to account.
People are struggling with what they're currently being paid because bills are getting higher and higher, and so you can understand why people are upset if they don't think they're getting decent pay deals or good working conditions.
Trains aren't clean, they're not always running on time. They're probably the most expensive in Europe, so it makes you wonder what they're doing with the money if they're not giving it to their employees.
Even though it's annoying, we have to support people who are striking because, we've all been there. We're all mistreated at work and such, so.
Pro-union, pro-strikes, pro-people needing to do what they need to do to get their wages up.
Pro-union, pro-strikes, we love to see it. Another thing we love to see is our own Ash Sarkar schooling the media classes on the importance of unions and strike action.
Ash, there'll be a lot of people waking up this morning who will be saying we have this horrific cost of living squeeze. Fuel costs have gone up dramatically. Even yesterday, they've gone up the most they have in 17 years. Energy prices are soaring. The last thing we need is the threat of rail action, which means on those 3 days when I have to go to work, I can't use my car because it's too expensive. I've got to go on the train, and now I can't do that either.
I'd actually flip it the other way around, all right? In a context where the cost of living crisis is being paid for by ordinary workers, the thing that you need are strong unions and the ability to collectively bargain for better pay and conditions. Now, why the RMT are striking, which is, I notice, not something people have talked about, is that workers who had been keeping the railways running during the pandemic are being threatened with job cuts and a pay freeze, which would mean that their pay isn't keeping up with inflation. And so that's why the union is doing their job and saying, we will use our strength, which is the fact that you can't run this without us, to protect and defend our workers' conditions. That is the job of a trade union. And if it's so important to keep the railway running, because I agree, these workers are totally essential, then the bosses should be coming up with a reasonable package that the workers can accept.
If this is so important that it causes so much disruption, why not meet the unions and compromise and value their position?
Well, I don't believe you can have it both ways. I don't believe that you can say we must give in to the demands because these workers are essential. Oh, but they're not essential enough that we say that strikes among those workers shouldn't be allowed anymore, which is what I believe. Now, this industry, if we're talking about people who are having to pay their taxes to bear this cost of living crisis, this industry will receive £16 billion in subsidies this year alone. This industry received billions of pounds in subsidies, meaning that not one rail worker worked without full pay during the whole of COVID. They're not asking for just the same pay and conditions. They want an 11% pay rise.
Because that is the job of a trade union. And here's the thing, why I think it's so dangerous for you to talk about making strike action illegal. Every single person in this country has benefited from rights which have been secured by trade unions and the right to strike, including minimum wage, maternity pay, sick pay. These are all things which, before they were made law, were won by trade unions, and they benefited everybody. Because you're essentially selling a myth to the people of this country. You're saying, well, if you ask nicely, if you play nicely, if you're a good little boy or girl, maybe the bosses will take pity on you. That's not how it works. Workers have one form of power, and that is collective bargaining. And every right we have as workers in this country has been secured by playing hardball.
And that was brilliant. Also very refreshing. Like, how often do we actually hear people on the television talk about the logic of why those workers are striking? Yeah, they'll often say in passing, oh, what they want is better pay and conditions. But they don't explain, from first principles, what is the point of a strike? What is a strike? Why are they doing it? Instead, what you get is lots of vox pops of people who might have their journey disrupted. People's journey being disrupted is significant. And the trade unions also take that into account, right? They don't enjoy disrupting people's days, right? But they're using the leverage they have, which Ash put so brilliantly. Because Ash can explain this all better than me, let's watch some more of that exchange.
The threat the bosses have is firing. The threat the worker has is, I won't come to work. It feels like the bottom line is that's where you are.
There are many, many industries, and there are many, many low-paid workers that many of these unions claim that they want to represent, that don't have the power to strike, that still turn up for work, that still negotiate with their bosses in a way.
So hang on. So you said there are many low-paid workers who don't go on strike. I wonder what the relationship is there. One of the reasons why, particularly on the London Underground, you've got some of the best paying conditions in the public sector is because the RMT are not who you F with. They go on strike, they walk out, they collectively organise.
And
that's why they've got good paying conditions. And then you're saying to people, well, be a nice little worker, accept your low pay and doff your cap and don't go on strike.
No, be good at your job and go and see your boss and ask for a pay rise. I think people in this country deserve better. I think they deserve good pay, good conditions.
The problem is we are all facing a huge squeeze financially. This is going to impact on all those essential workers that have to use the rail network to go and do their jobs. They don't have a choice. And right now is not the time to do this. And as you said just then, they have good pay, they have good standards, they have good various issues that they have organised themselves in the past, the RMT, so they actually are well looked after. It's a very strong trade union, clearly.
But why pick now?
Why pick now?
Because if you take your foot off the gas, then suddenly all the backsliding on the pensions and the job cuts and the pay provision. I completely empathise with the issue of it being disruptive. I don't drive, right? Public transport is my only way to get around, and that, for me, indicates why it's so important for bosses to come with a serious package to the RMT on pension protection and on protecting their workers from job cuts.
Where does the money come from? We, the taxpayer, are subsidising these industries to the tune of billions already. So now, so people who you claim to worry about will end up paying in their taxes for those pensions.
You know who's not taking, huge pay cuts? You know whose jobs are being protected? It's CEOs, it's corporations. We're looking at, I think, having a cost of living crisis where instead of profits being taxed in order to protect ordinary workers, it's the other way around, right? Ordinary workers are bailing out corporations, and the RMT and other trade unions are saying, we are not having
So they strike in good times, they strike in bad times, they just strike all the time,
and
basically.
That's how you get things like pension provision and paternity
No, that's how
pay,
you get legislation that will stop striking.
Now, Ash, I'm sure you think she was effective there, but so did the GMB audience. You saw the guy she was debating with, Christo, a guy from Talk Radio, sort of saying this strike is going to prompt legislation to ban these strikers. And after watching that debate, GMB viewers seem to have agreed with Ash. So should the law be changed to stop transport workers striking? Yes, 31%, no, 69%.
You watch the opening sort of gambit from the presenter, And of course, we're on the left. We're very familiar with trade unions. We know that trade unions are necessary to push up people's wages. And he's saying, well, look, there's a cost of living crisis. They shouldn't strike. Well, no, they should strike. It's a sort of surreal thing. But of course, we have to accept that that's a relatively widespread way of thinking. One thing I would add to what Ash said was when that gentleman, Christo, when he said, how are we going to pay for it? Well, we've got 9% inflation. We pay VAT. That means the Exchequer's bringing in more tax revenue through VAT because, of course, the price of goods and services are going up. Tens of billions that's raising, by the way. There are some upsides to inflation, not many. We can use that. There you go. And it's so strange to me that these workers aren't even asking for particularly much. They're asking for their pay, 11% pay rise. Right now, inflation's 9%. It's probably going to go higher than that this year. My goodness, it could go to 12%, 13%, 15% this year. It could. And that's before interest rate rises for people who own properties. By the way, those are also passed on to renters because the landlords have mortgages. So they're asking basically for the same terms and conditions that they had and pay and living standards that they had last year. That's all they're asking for. And it really does tell you something quite instructive about where Britain is now, where it's somehow radical to ask for the same living standards and pay as a year ago. Sorry, I just want to remain in the same set of circumstances I was in 12 months ago. Well, that means you shouldn't be allowed to strike. We're now going to criminalize a basic human right, which has been around for 100 years. And as Ash said, is the basis and foundation of many good things that we take for granted, like a 8-hour day or a weekend or pensions. I don't know where this man comes from. If you want to live in a decent society with a weekend, with pensions, with sick pay, with holidays, you need trade unions. Now, if you don't like those things, don't have trade unions. But guess what? Most people do. That's why Ash won the debate and why the polling was in her favour.
All of us here at Novara Media are working harder than ever to keep scrutinising establishment politicians and the media barons who protect them. We don't have billionaire funders. We don't have advertising partnerships. We're funded entirely by you. If you've ever thought about supporting us, now's the time to go to novaramedia.com/support and donate anything you can from just £1 per month. Defy the corporate media, join our monthly supporters and help build our supporter base to 10,000 strong.